and welcome to the Daily Space. My name is Annie Wilson, and most weekdays, the CosmoQuest team is here putting science in your brain. Today, however, is for Rocket Roundup. Let's get to it, shall we? So first up this week was the launch of the CAS 501 on March 22nd at 6:07 UTC. A Soyuz 2.1 Alpha frigate took off from pad 31-6 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. It was a very overcast day, so the rocket disappeared into the clouds shortly after launch, and live footage was replaced by an animation. The launch itself was conducted by GK Launch Services, a commercial company owned by Glav Cosmos, which itself is a subsidiary of Roscosmos. This seemingly unusual setup allows Roscosmos to support commercial launches. The rocket headed into a 498-kilometer sun-synchronous orbit. This orbit is useful for imaging satellites like the CAS 500 because it allows the spacecraft to pass over a location at the same solar time each day. As sun-synchronous orbits increase in altitude, they also increase in inclination. A 500-kilometer sun-synchronous orbit is inclined to around 97 degrees, which is very slightly retrograde. At their extreme, sun-synchronous orbits can be inclined to 142 degrees. Before I talk about payloads, I wanted to take a moment to point out the rocket's paint job. Usually, GK Launch Services paint their rockets with an orange and gray color scheme. This time, however, the Soyuz 2.1 Alpha was painted white and blue. Roscosmos shared that the inspiration for the new paintwork was the prototype of the Voskhod launch vehicle, which is located at the VDNKH Space Pavilion in Moscow. It is painted white, and when launched, the rocket looks white from frost covering the liquid oxygen tanks. On the Voskhod launch vehicle 60 years ago, the first cosmonaut of the planet, Yuri Gagarin, went on a flight from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. On to the payloads. This 1,937th R7-derived Soyuz carried 38 satellites, ranging from 1-unit CubeSats to 500 kilograms to orbit. The missions are varied and include communication and technology demonstrations, space junk removal tests, imaging, and more. The biggest satellite, CAS 501, is the first of a pair of imaging satellites for Korea Aerospace Research Institute, the South Korean space agency. CAS 500's main imager, Advanced Earth Imaging Sensor System, will have a ground resolution of 2 meters in color mode and 0.5 meter in panchromatic mode. It has a planned mission duration of 4 years. I don't have time to talk about all of the 37 other satellites, so the team and I picked out a few that looked interesting to us. So first up is ELSA D. We get a lot of questions about space junk, so it definitely felt appropriate to talk about the ELSA D Chaser Target pair of satellites. These satellites were built by Astroscale, a Japanese company developing orbital debris removal satellites. They will demonstrate their system by first deploying the target, which is equipped with laser retroreflectors and other systems. Then the Chaser will be deployed to rendezvous with the target. Chaser will conduct 3 additional increasingly complicated rendezvous maneuvers as the mission progresses. One of our team members was really excited about the CubeSat astronomy by NASA and Yonsei using Vision Alignment Coronagraph program, also known as Cannivel-C. Cannivel-C is a 2 CubeSat mission. It's designed to demonstrate that CubeSats can be used for solar astronomy. A 1-unit CubeSat named Timon is equipped with an optical camera for taking solar pictures. The 2-unit CubeSat named Pumbaa acts as the coronagraph, occulting the sun, much like how the moon blocks the sun during a total solar eclipse as seen from Earth. This allows the camera to only image the fine outer solar atmosphere. The two satellites were developed by Yonsei University in South Korea, working with, you guessed it, NASA. Another interesting set of small sats on the mission are the GRU-S1b, C, D, and E. No, there's no error with our counting. GRU-S1 Alpha was launched in 2018. These were a bit bigger, coming in at 100 kilograms each. They are Earth observation satellites that can obtain 2.5-meter ground resolution panchromatic images and 5-meter ground resolution multispectral images. The 4 satellites launched on the Soyuz mission will allow daily updates to Earth imagery. Let's take a look at the launch. Small sats are the future, and no company does them quite like Rocket Lab. After the break, we'll be back to talk about their latest mission, named They Go Up So Fast. Stay tuned. Next up, at 22:30 UTC that very same day, Rocket Lab launched their second Electron of 2021 from Launch Complex 1 on the Mahia Peninsula in New Zealand. They Go Up So Fast is the 19th launch overall of the Electron rocket and broke the 100 satellite milestone. The Electron rose swiftly from the pad into relatively clear skies, and the onboard camera showed beautiful views of the Earth as the rocket gained altitude. This mission carried 6 customer satellites into orbit, as well as the next iteration of the company's Photon space tug. The first customer satellite we're going to talk about is Black Sky 7, one of the Block 2 satellites in the commercial imaging constellation of the same name, which is planned to have between 30 and 60 satellites when fully operational. They will be able to image a location as frequently as every 30 minutes, day or night. The Black Sky satellites have a ground resolution of about a meter from a 500-kilometer orbit. They weigh 56 kilograms and have sufficient propellant for an orbital life of 3 years. They are able to produce 1,000 images per day in either single image or video mode. This wasn't the first time a Black Sky satellite has ridden on a Rocket Lab launch vehicle. Black Sky 2 and 3 both went to orbit on Electrons in June and August of 2019, respectively. Other members of the constellation have been sent to orbit on other launch vehicles over the last 3 years, including an Indian PSLV and several SpaceX Falcon 9s. Another interesting satellite on the mission is the Hatchling Veery Clay satellite, a 1-unit CubeSat built by Care Weather Technologies in, wait for it, just 3 months. Hatchling Veery is the first test of Care Weather's custom flight computer, batteries, solar panels, drag panels, 3 axes, reaction wheels, and structures. It is also the first spaceflight of the PPT-3-1C integrated propulsion module made by Applied Ion Systems. The goal of the mission is to test all of these components, so they did not include a weather sensor. The mission duration is planned to be about 6 months with an orbital life of 3.5 years. Initially, Hatchling Veery will be free tumbling and it will make contact with the Iridium network. It will perform a number of attitude control tests and periodically communicate data about the health of the satellite systems. According to CareWeather's website, Hatchling was developed by Alex Laraway, Patrick Walton, and Harris Rother-Ermel in a record-breaking 3 months. Hatchling is dedicated to Clay Reynolds, a good friend of Alex, who passed away in 2020. 6 months after the first Photon mission, First Light, Rocket Lab designated a second Photon and dubbed it Pathstone. During ascent, it performed its kickstage function. After delivering the customer payloads to their circular orbits, Pathstone continued on its own mission with different flight software. Rocket Lab CEO Peter Beck described this process as sending a magic command. Pathstone is an opportunity to test subsystems and procedures with Photon before the first flight of interplanetary Photon, which will carry NASA's Capstone mission to lunar orbit later this year. Capstone will be launched from Rocket Lab's Launch Complex 2 at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport, also known as Mars, in Virginia. Let's take a look at the launch.
Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
History is being made, and Rocket Lab is doing it with puns and giggles. After the break, we'll take a look at humanity's first chaotic spacewalk and the more chaotic mission it was part of. Stay tuned. Last week on the show, we told you about Vladimir Komarov's mission aboard Voskhod 1. This week in rocket history, we have the follow-up mission, Voskhod 2. It launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan on March 18, 1965 at 700 hours UTC. Commander Pavel Balyayev and pilot Alexei Leonov rode the three-staged Voskhod vehicle to an orbit of 498 by 137 kilometers with an inclination of 65 degrees towards the equator. The Voskhod 2 capsule was a modified version of the first Voskhod and had an inflatable Volga airlock attached to the main hatch. This meant that in case of emergency during takeoff or landing, the crew could not eject. During their second orbit, cosmonaut Belyayev deployed the airlock and extended it out into space. Cosmonaut Leonov then entered the airlock in his modified Vostok Sokol-1 flight suit and strapped himself to a bungee cord and an umbilicus, which provided oxygen. Belyayev then closed the hatch from the inside of the capsule and started depressurizing the airlock. When the airlock's pressure was equal to that of outer space, Leonov opened the outer hatch of the airlock and pushed himself out. At that moment, he became the first person in history to perform an extravehicular activity, commonly known as a spacewalk. Let's take a look. The spacewalk lasted over 10 minutes, during which Leonov reported seeing the stretch of Earth from the Straits of Gibraltar to the Caspian Sea. When the time came to re-enter the capsule, Leonov realized he had a problem. His spacesuit was deformed due to its internal pressure pushing out against the vacuum of space. He could barely move, and his feet and hands were no longer firmly secure in his boots and gloves. He had no way to pull himself back into the airlock. Not wanting to cause alarm on the ground, he decided to just not report on his condition. Leonov realized that he could lower the pressure by slowly releasing the trapped oxygen by opening a specialized valve installed in his suit. As the oxygen left his suit, he gradually regained a bit of flexibility, just enough to be able to pull himself back in and close the airlock's outer hatch. With Leonov safe on board, the issues continued for the daring cosmonauts. Just as they were preparing for their deorbit burn, Leonov reported that their re-entry guidance system, which is literally the system responsible for guiding their descent back into the atmosphere, wasn't functioning at all. They had to rely on manual piloting for the extremely risky maneuver. Leonov recalled that the next call from Mission Control, which had cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin on the line, asked them where they had landed. They haven't even re-entered the atmosphere yet. It seemed like Mission Control had no idea of what was going on. Belyayev informed them of their situation, and the crew started to prepare for re-entry. Belyayev was responsible for orienting the craft into the correct angle for re-entry, while Leonov had to calculate where they would land as a function of when they fired their engines. Leonov had to choose a location that was in the Soviet Union, sparsely populated, so bystanders weren't in harm's way, but also not completely desolate, so they could be rescued in a reasonable amount in time, just in case his calculations were off. He aimed for the city of Perm, and at the appropriate time, Belyayev fired the retro engines for 10 seconds and then separated from the capsule's orbital module. Still, as Leonov wrote in an article for the Air and Space magazine, something felt very wrong. As they entered the atmosphere, they felt way more drag than they had anticipated. After a while, they started feeling intense gravitational forces, with Leonov reporting his instruments measured as much as 10 Gs. He looked out the window and saw that they were spinning rapidly. One of the cables that was attached to the orbital module, it didn't separate correctly. So they were dragging it along with them into the atmosphere. This caused their center of mass to shift just enough for the capsule and its attached baggage to tumble and spin. Eventually, the cable burnt up and broke, and at an altitude of about 100 kilometers, the craft stabilized. Everything else during landing worked nominally, with the drogue parachutes and the landing parachutes opening just when they should have. And eventually, the retro rocket designed to slow them down fired, and they made a safe landing just 2,000 kilometers outside of Perm. Remember, Leonov was aiming for Perm, not the wilderness 2,000 kilometers outside of it. The area they landed in was extremely hard to get to, had harsh weather, and was known to be home to wild bears and wolves. What's worse, they didn't even know if ground control knew where they had landed. Fortunately, after a couple of hours, they were spotted by a civilian cargo plane who informed some local pilots. A rescue mission was arranged using a helicopter, but the forested terrain the cosmonauts were in made it impossible for the helicopter to land. The helicopter also tried pulling them up with an improvised rope ladder, but their spacesuits were too heavy and they got caught in the thick trees. The civilians did everything they could to help, including dropping them a bottle of cognac, which broke, and an axe. But it was getting dark and extremely cold. The stranded cosmonauts pulled the capsule's parachutes over the capsule as a means of insulation, got back inside the capsule, and went to sleep. The next morning, they were met by a rescue party who were led there by the local pilots who had seen them the day before. The rescue party included a fellow cosmonaut, 2 doctors, and a film crew, but the stranded cosmonauts were still in no condition to get back to the city by themselves. The rescue party made sure that the cosmonauts were warm, safe, and fed. Until the next morning, they found a clearing in the forest large enough for a helicopter to land, some 9 kilometers away, from which they were finally picked up. As a final note, the source for most of this article, for most of the story is the aforementioned article written by Leonev himself in the Air and Space magazine, which will be included in the show notes and is a fascinating and recommended read. After this break, we'll be back with the stats and this week's space fact. To wrap things up, here's a running tally of a few spaceflight statistics for the current year. Estimated number of toilets currently in space, 5. 3 are installed on the International Space Station, 1 is on the Crew Dragon, and 1 is on the Soyuz. We're still looking into getting an official number, so maybe for sure we'll know how many exactly. Please bear with us while we get that number. All right, so total orbital launch attempts so far this year, 24, including 1 failure, and 593 satellites have been launched from those 24 launch attempts. I keep track of orbital launches by where they launched from, also known as spaceport. Here's that breakdown. USA 10, China 7, Kazakhstan 3, New Zealand 2, India 1, Russia 1. Your random space fact for the week is that John Young smuggled a corned beef sandwich in his spacesuit on the Gemini 3 mission 56 years ago this week. Gemini 3 was the first crewed mission of the Gemini program, NASA's rapid development of rendezvous and docking capability. During the flight, astronaut Young took the sandwich out of his pocket and took a bite. Crumbs of rye bread started floating around the cabin, he said. Small particles can cause a hazard to spacecraft components, so he put the sandwich away. A few years later, John Young brought some corned beef onto a shuttle flight he commanded with permission. Nowadays, they have officially sanctioned sandwiches on the International Space Station, but they mostly use tortillas because they have a lower risk of crumbs. This has been the Daily Space.